Welcome to episode 176 of The Route. The Route is a glorified coffee chat and podcast forum that takes you from A to B with a new guest every episode. As always, I'm your host, Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. Quickly, before we begin, as per usual, if you haven't already, follow the podcast, subscribe to the podcast. We're on all major platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google, XYZ, whatever you want, we're there. So follow us there. And in addition to that too, we are available via video, specifically on YouTube. You can simply search The Route Podcast, The Route, or using our username, The Route Cast. That's CAST after The Route. And that's the same username that we have for social media. So all the classic Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, etc. But more importantly for what we're discussing on this podcast, LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with myself, the guest, like-minded people, check us out there, The Routecast, all social media, especially LinkedIn, and that way you can know, hey, whose episode's coming out this week, what's it about, grow your network, maintain it, start it, go from there. And then with that, we can now get into today's guest. I'd now like to welcome someone who has quite the resume, from investor to founder and board member, and a ton of experience in between. The co-founder and managing partner at Misfit Ventures, Mandy Potter. Welcome to The Route. How's it going?
Good. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat today.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I was kind of looking into you, I kind of came across, because LinkedIn suggested you initially, and I saw all the cool things you've done so far. And I guess as the podcast states, The Route, if you don't mind maybe sharing where it began and how do we get to today where you're now a part of so many cool things going on.
Yeah, sure. So typically when I explain my story, I go pretty far back, like into childhood, because that's kind of where it all began. I was always a bit of an entrepreneurial kid, so I was the type that had lemonade stands and that sort of thing. So kind of that typical story. But I remember when other kids would be watching like cartoons or something like that, I was actually in my makeshift office working. So my mom used to work at this print shop, like copy and print shop. So they had like all these old, really cool like Macs and then cash registers and stuff like that in this basement. So whenever I'd go to her work, I would always end up bringing something home. And so I had this makeshift office in my house that was just full of like old cash registers and Macs and stuff like that. And I would play office and play business and that sort of thing. So my story actually started very, very early. And I played a lot of sports quite competitively, but that sort of entrepreneurial spirit just always kind of stayed with me. Even if, say I wanted something, like I wanted the new PlayStation or I wanted a trampoline or something like that, my parents were always like, well, we're not just going to give it to you, like you have to work for it. And so that's when, things like lemonade stands and shit like that would come up. I'd find ways to make money to be able to get what I wanted, I guess. It was never just hand delivered to me. Every now and then they would sort of say like, okay, if you make half, we'll pitch in half type thing, just because I was so busy with sports and that sort of thing. But so kind of skipping forward a little bit, after high school, I went to Emily Carr, which is Canada's best design school. Have no idea to this day how I got in, to be completely honest, because I'm not artistic at all. And so it's an interesting process because it's like you go through interviews, you have to share a portfolio with like this room full of people. I literally don't know how the hell I got in. I made my portfolio the night before when I found out that I had to have one, whereas people have been building that portfolio for years throughout their high school years and that sort of thing. So I think one of the reasons why I was accepted was just my creativity. And I consider myself a pretty creative person. So I was in Emily Carr with these really amazing artists, like from painters to sculptors to illustrators. I can't do any of that. So whenever there was different projects I was there for graphic design, which is more technical, so it makes a little bit more sense with me. But when there's different projects, like we'd have like painting class and that sort of photography class and that sort of thing, all of my projects were never typical. So there was like always a very like creative lens to it. So instead of just like doing a photo shoot, I would do like a photo shoot with some sort of like edgy, different type of thing. And so I always got really amazing marks. Again, don't know how I did it. Somehow did it. And when I was going to Emily Carr, I was actually cleaning houses to make some extra cash. And funny enough, my brother was doing the same thing. And so we kind of saw how broken the industry was. Like, there was like no easy way to find a good cleaner, to like know their rate, to book them, anything like that. And so we actually decided to start a company that ended up being called Cleanify. Went through a few different name changes over the years. And it was a marketplace for home services. So you basically could put in your postal code, see all of the cleaners in your neighborhood, see their reviews from other customers, see their ratings, see their pricing, their availability, and be able to book it all and manage it all online. Which, 15 plus years ago, that wasn't, it sounds simple nowadays, but this was not a simple thing that existed back then. And so that, I actually was considering dropping out of Emily Carr when we started that company, because I was still going to school and just didn't really have the time. And we were seeing some traction with it. And we eventually we started this company in my parents' basement. So we would like show up at like 6 a.m. and work, have to go to school, and then come back and work. And then we'd like eventually move to like another small kind of shitty office, and then eventually moved to Gastown, where we got into this small accelerator in Vancouver. And then we applied to a few larger accelerators in the States, and we actually got accepted into 500 startups. So we decided to ditch everything. At this point, I graduated school, so I didn't have to be a dropout. But we decided to ditch everything and move to San Francisco for the program. I think it was 4 months, something like that, a 4-month program. But we ended up staying. So we stayed for multiple years. We ended up raising millions in venture capital, growing the company, creating an amazing team. And it was a really cool, interesting experience. And when that company was done, we decided to move back to Vancouver. My brother actually stayed a little bit longer in California than I did. I moved back to Vancouver, and at this time, they were talking about federally legalizing cannabis. And so at the same time as that was happening, I was actually not a cannabis user at this point in my life. But at the same time, my cousin and best friend was going through stage 4 cancer treatment. And one of the only things that would help her through her treatment was THC and CBD. But there's no easy way to get it for her. And there's kind of like a couple different issues with this, is that one, there's still a lot of stigma around cannabis use. I mean, there still is, but so she didn't really want to be seen buying it. And then another part of it was that some days she just didn't really feel well enough to go and get it, right? So I saw this sort of like accessibility issue, and from living in San Francisco for so long, I was like, well, shit, I can get like literally anything I want delivered to my doorstep in like seconds. And that was never the case in Canada. We're always behind a little bit. So I saw this as like a bit of an accessibility issue. And then with like the legalization of cannabis coming up, I was like, well, what if I start, Canada's first on-demand cannabis delivery company? And so I did that, and it went pretty viral. Like we were on like a multi-million-dollar run rate in the first few months, which is insane. Shot across Canada really quickly. It was also, I was extremely burnt out. I was a solo founder with this company and was kind of doing everything, and sort of started hiring some people to help me. But especially in the early days, like before it really exploded, I was like the product, I was the marketing, I was the backup delivery driver, I was absolutely everything, partnerships. And I remember like it got to a point where I couldn't even like go out for dinner or anything like that. Like I remember specifically being at this one dinner with friends and looking at my phone and an order coming in, a bunch of orders coming in, and not having a driver for it and being like, I have to go. And then this other point where I have a cabin, it's about an hour and a half outside of Vancouver, and I couldn't even go out to the cabin because if something happened, like I couldn't get there fast enough. And so I remember having a few breakdowns. There was quite a few tears that were shed, which many founders, if they're listening, they'll understand what that's like. And there's also many tears that were shed throughout my experience with Cleanify. It's all up and downs. And so I actually ended up selling that company probably earlier, I think, than I maybe would have, just given its trajectory, but based off of, what was kind of happening with me personally, and just the burnout and how fast it was moving and all of that. I was given an offer, and it was a great offer, and so I ended up exiting that company. And at this point in my life, it was actually interesting. I was like, so what do I do next? Okay, so I just sold this company. What's something, what's going to be my next idea? And I was like, well, I could easily duplicate this for liquor delivery. I was like, I have all the technology. There's no liquor delivery service in Canada. I'm sure it would explode, so I'm going to do that. So I started that company and actually got into an accelerator in San Francisco again. So I moved back in February of 2020, and I'm sure you know what comes next, which is COVID. And so sometime in March, early to mid-March, we were following the news really carefully, and my father-in-law called one day, and he was like, you guys should maybe consider coming back home. They're talking about border closures and all this stuff. This is very early days of this company, barely even any revenue at that point. And so we're like, okay, we should drive back. So we literally left like midday, got back home at 5 a.m. or something like that. And I ended up waking up at 8 a.m. in excruciating pain. And I was just like, it was kind of here in my stomach area, and I was like, I don't know what this is. And I was trying to like ride it out. Because we're kind of being told like you don't go to the hospital or to doctors or anything like that, but it was excruciating. And so I eventually went to an urgent care clinic that was open, and they immediately rushed me to the hospital. And I ended up going through the next year of my life took a whole different path. I spent a month in the ICU in a life-threatening condition, and had developed something called necrotizing pancreatitis, which they deemed potentially as a result of gallstones or something like that. They actually don't know to this day, but essentially what happened is that my pancreas was dying. I had infections on all my organs. I had blood clots all over my body. I was on a feeding tube. I was dying, basically. Most people that get necrotizing pancreatitis don't make it. And so, coming out of that, I now know how fortunate I am. But once I eventually went home and then slowly recovered, it took me about a year to fully recover from it. I had to learn how to walk and eat again, and pretty much everything. I was thinking, okay, well, what do I do with my life now? And I sort of thought, like, I need to learn balance for the first time. I started my first company at 19, and I've always just worked. And like I said, even before that, I was extremely competitive in sports. So it's kind of all I knew was being like a workhorse and subscribing to hustle culture, to be completely honest. And there's so many times in my life I've burnt out. And this was kind of a wake-up call to be like, okay, maybe you need to learn how to chill a little bit and take care of yourself. And so I ended up getting an exec position at a larger software company. And it was honestly like awesome. Like, I loved it because I worked 9 to 5. I got weekends off. I got a really good paycheck that was consistent. I had all this extra time where like I ended up writing a children's book. I learned how to do pottery. My partner and I had my daughter. And so I was just like, wow, like this is like what balance is. I like worked out all the time. I learned how to cook really well and take care of my body and all this stuff. But I was fucking bored. Like, I was so bored. Like, innately who I am is a builder, and is an entrepreneur. And so I was like, all right, I think I'm done with that. Then this is over a few year period, working with a couple of companies. I think I'm over that. What's my next step going to be? And in my head, I was kind of like, I always knew I wanted to go into the investment side. I was like a 19, 20-year-old living in Silicon Valley. This is many years ago, trying to raise capital as like a queer, very tattooed woman. And we didn't really talk about diversity and things like that back then. And my co-founder was also my brother, who is a white, straight, cis dude. So you'd walk into these rooms and I'd be completely ignored. And I was like, fuck, this kind of sucks. Like, even when I talked, like, they would respond and look back at my brother. And I was like, hello? Like, I'm speaking here, I have smart things to say. And so I saw that bias firsthand, and I knew one day I wanted to sit on the other side of the table, and ensure that, marginalized founders had a voice and were heard and also received capital. So skip forward to like where I was after, exec positions is I was like, maybe this is, the time that I don't think I was starting another company, but maybe get into the investment side. And so I kind of went into like an exploratory phase where I knew that if this was something that I wanted to do, it wasn't like a year-long thing where I could like do it for a year and then move on. Like it's a commitment. And so I had dozens, if not hundreds of phone calls with multiple VCs in Canada and the US, with different organizations, just really sort of like figuring out, is this what I want to do next? Is this what I want to commit myself to for a long period of time? And I was really fortunate because I went through a program that was called the Women Venture Forward program. It was the first cohort of its type, and through that experience, I met a lot of amazing VCs, some of the most prominent ones in Canada, or I would say even North America. One of which became my mentor, and so I sort of had a conversation with her, and I was like, I don't know a ton about VC except for what I'm, teaching myself. Like every single day I was teaching myself. I literally like download agreements and like write all over it and just learn and try to absorb. And then also being a founder, raising VC, I knew that experience. But I was like, maybe it makes sense for me to join a firm, get some experience, and then eventually I wanted to start my own fund. Like I knew I always wanted to do that. I wanted to start a queer fund because it was something that was like a missing gap in Canada, but really in North America. So I, would talk to her about this, and we'd sort of, talk about what my next steps were. And one day she was just like, Mandy, like you have the operator experience, founders. I've advised dozens of founders, if not more, in my lifetime. I know what it takes to build a company from zero to tens of millions of dollars. She's like, you'll learn those other pieces as you go. And she's like, you need to start the fund right now. And I was like, okay, maybe I will start the fund right now. And I was kind of in an interesting position too, because the firms that wanted to hire me were generally the smaller ones that really appreciated the operator background. So having other founders on the team and that type of experience, but they were typically smaller funds. So they didn't really have the cash to hire me. And then when I talked to more of like the corporate funds and that sort of thing, they wanted people with like an investment banking background or, something that just wasn't me. Like I kind of didn't fit into a lot of places. And so I think like the typical sort of like founder mentality is like, well then I'll just create my own, like I'll just build my own then. And so that's what I did is everything kind of like happened at the right moment. So I was introduced to my two co-founders through a couple events. We had known of each other, but we sort of like started talking, and they were like, us all three individually were thinking about starting Canada's first queer fund. And so we're like, well, we shouldn't compete with each other. We should work together, especially given our background. So like I'm the serial founder. My other partner is the CPA, and then, legal, bits, risk, that sort of thing. My other founder is a big ecosystem person. So like managing director of Canada's only queer accelerator, sits on the board of Queer Tech, really involved in a lot of, events and the ecosystem as a whole. And so our background just made so much sense together. So we were like, okay, let's just do it. And we were all at a point where at this point I was multiple months in of not having a job and really exploring what that next step looked like for me. One of them was just leaving a position. The other one was kind of on exploratory, phase as well in their life. And so we all were able to start it full time right away, which was really cool. And so this was probably, I want to say April of this year, so quite fresh that we decided to go all in. And so now we have formed Canada's first LGBTQ plus VC fund. It'll also be North America's largest. We've had significant traction in our fundraising already. This is not an easy market to fundraise in, especially as, you know, a new emerging manager. The Canadians are typically quite conservative, so they want to be like, ensure that you have the most amazing track record, you know, background in investments and that sort of thing. And so given our history of our investment history, like I've done some angel investments. My other partner has done many investments, been in VC for a few years, including, you know, into one unicorn and that sort of thing. I think that the market is being really responsive to what we're doing. One being that we're bridging a massive gap. So there's a study done by an organization called Start Out, and they looked at 140,000 founders over a 22-year period. So this is not a small data set at all. And it showed that queer founders create 44% more exits, 36% more jobs, and 114% more patents. Yet they only receive 0.5% of VC funding. And so this is a massive opportunity. It's also a massive market. Like up to 30% of Gen Z identify under the queer umbrella now. And that's our existing and future cohort of entrepreneurs. So it's a massive market. They overachieve. They're severely underfunded. So everything just made sense to start this fund. And so, yeah, I think that the market is responsive to that data, responsive to our backgrounds, and responsive to just this massive gap that we're trying to fill. And our advisor team is really amazing. So we have the managing partner of the first Black fund in Canada, managing partner of the first Indigenous fund in Canada, managing partner of one of the first women funds in Canada. We also have managing partner and co-founder of the world's first IoT fund, and then Arlene Dickinson is also the first woman dragon on Dragon's Den. So we have sort of a very like first advisor team that is really guiding us through what this process looks like. And that was obviously very strategic, and we're very, very fortunate to have them. But yeah, I think that it's just such a massive gap, and we're filling it. So that's what I'm doing now. I remember one time many years ago, someone asked me, what would you be doing if you were retired? And I said, well, if I'm retired, I probably have a lot of money in the bank. And so I just invested in companies I believed in, and I would just help support them and advise them. And I was like, wait, that's a job. It's called venture capital. And so I kind of like reframed this idea of retirement for myself, where I'm like, I'm retired right now. Like I get to do what I would do if I retired every single day, and I love what I do. And I'm very fortunate to be where I am right now. And so that's my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's amazing. I really appreciate sharing your route so far, and there's just so many things to kind of get into. And I know for time, I can't ask all the questions, but maybe we'll try to have a few for each, let's say, section of your route so far. So I guess going back to the beginning, you're talking about the lemonade stands and kind of being, you know, very entrepreneurial from the start. Was that something that ever wavered? Like, did you ever have any other career aspirations where you were younger, or did you always know, hey, like business is my forte?
I always knew it was business. Like I remember when I was really young, I was like, oh, being a lawyer would be really cool. And then at one point, I don't remember what movie it was, but I watched a movie and I was like, I think I'd be really good at advertising, like, because I'm creative and I'd be able to sell this to different products and that sort of thing. So I think that, like, no matter what you think about was going to be my potential future, a lot of it had to do with being creative and also selling. Like, I love to sell, and when I say sell, I don't mean like I want to go and sell cars or anything like that. I mean, like, I love to sell a vision that I'm extremely passionate about. And that's something I've always been really good at. And so I think that's kind of where, like, the lawyer idea came in, is that, like, if I were to be, you know, if I had a client that I was really passionate about or really believed in or that sort of thing, like, I'd be able to sell them on their behalf. And then same with, like, advertising. So I think it was always really similar, and I think this was always meant to be my path.
No, that definitely makes sense. And even just what you're saying there about movies, I feel like my parents were in accounting, and then I always thought, oh, I'll just do the same thing. But then I started seeing movies and understanding a bit more about, you know, marketing and advertising. I forget exactly which one, similar to you, it kind of stood out to me. But I remember there's like 2 or 3 movies. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that was a career right? So I can definitely relate to that. And then going back to when you first started Cleanify with your brother. So one of the things that kind of I've been understanding from your route is you have the very like just do it mentality, right? Oh, there's a gap here. You know what? Let's just do it, and then that's how you make your own opportunities. How does that translate to the companies you founded? Because let's say someone's listening now, they're like, oh, I have this great idea, but I don't have the tech skills or the web development skills, so on and so forth. How did you go about it, especially with, let's say, Cleanify 15 plus years ago, where did you know how to do that yourself? Did you find people? Yeah, I
Yeah,
was
I
curious
think
about that.
it depends on your situation too, right? Like we all have different risk factors, and so this is something that is really important for me to talk about because it was sort of this like this was many years ago at this point, but it hit me head on where I had one of my best friends worked for a large company and was like, oh, I just really want to quit this and like go do my dream job, which is like working in film and that sort of thing. And I was like, well, just do it. Like, just do it. Like, you just, like, you have to be, kind of like I do, like, just, take your passion and go do it type thing. And they're like, well, Mandy, like, I don't have, like, the safety net that you have. And I said, what do you mean? And they're like, well, you have parents that if something ever happened to you financially, you can take those risks and you could go and live with your parents. Like, you have a safety net. I don't have that. And I was like, holy shit, I never thought about, like, the risks associated with starting a business, right? And so I think that there's a lot of people that love to start a business, but they're not in a position where it's they can handle taking that type of risk for many different reasons. But I think it's so I think that's one thing that a lot of potential entrepreneurs really think about. And another thing as well is that it depends on your situation when you're starting a company. So like when I started my second company, I had money at that point to be able to like bootstrap it and invest my own cash and hire some developers to do the tech side and that sort of thing. But with, Cleanify, we didn't really have that. So you do things really scrappy. Like I remember we used to drive around and hand out checks to our cleaners because we didn't have the funds to be able to like set up this, system where we could have that automated or anything like that, right? Or we didn't want to have, fees taken off by Stripe because we couldn't afford to do that at that point. And so it really depends on like your risk levels, but I think there's a lot of creative ways that you can do things really cheap. Like I'm really good at being scrappy. If I had to start a company right now, even if I had all the money in the world in the bank, I would do it as cheap as humanly possible because you want to be able to like prove it out before you put too much money in it. I come across way too many founders that are like, I need to go and raise, even 200K tomorrow so that I can build out my idea. And I'm like, no, build your idea in a really scrappy way, prove that people want to use it, and then you can go and raise money. And it's going to be a lot easier to raise money at that point too. So getting yourself to like an MVP, not even like getting yourself to like product market fit, but just to prove that some people want it or that they'll use it, I think can be done pretty cheap.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point where almost like if someone's like from what you're saying, you prove it out, and then essentially when you finally do get that cash, it's like pouring gasoline over it, right? Is what you're saying, which makes a ton of sense. And then one of the last questions I have before I have the two final wrap up questions I like to ask every guest is when you're talking about your route, you're kind of mentioning how you'd come up with an idea and then okay, how can I execute this? And it sounded like hey, you would have these discussions, you would leverage conversations you're having with people. What kind of medium did you use to have those conversations? Was it simply having LinkedIn? Was it already an established network? Like, how did you go about that? Because I'm sure, coming out of design school, you didn't always have contacts that were at VC. So I was kind of curious how that was about, and then someone was listening, they could, hear how to do that themselves.
Yeah, I think that like joining some form of program, like there's like millions of accelerators and stuff out there where they'll take you if you just have an idea, and then there's some that won't take you unless you're already producing millions in revenue, right? So I think depending on your stage, and assuming that this question is obviously for like very early stage founders, I think joining some form of program is really helpful because through that you're gonna find other founders who will become your friends. They'll have connections. You're going to be introduced to a lot of business leaders, potentially mentors. So I think that's really important. Co-working spaces can also be good for that. But like the biggest thing is just going to like every networking event possible. So some of like the most impressive founders I see at every event that I go to. And they're typically like pitching at that event and getting their name out there. Because there's a lot of ways to get cash than just VC, right? Like there's angels, but even before angels, there's a lot of non-dilutive capital, such as grants or doing pitch competitions, stuff like that, that people don't take advantage of. But I always see the same companies at all of these pitch competitions that are a part of like these networking events, and they're the ones that are going to be the most successful because of it. And that's how they build their network.
Is that something that you ever look at as well? Like, let's say you're going to all these different networking events and you finally keep seeing them and seeing them at all these different events. You're like, hey, like this person has, like, I need to finally have a conversation with them. Like, is that maybe one of the characteristics you look for?
Totally, 100%. Yeah. Like if they made sense for my thesis of who we invest in, and I kept seeing them at different events, like to me, I'm like, that shows a type of hustle that I like, where they're really just trying to get their name out there. They're trying to have as many conversations as possible. They're trying to win money so that they can, keep their business going. And so yeah, I definitely think that that's something that stands out to me for sure.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. It's kind of cool too how you're saying, like, even just as you said there quickly, like as long as it aligns to your thesis, like just making sure that, and that's something I haven't heard, at least from 176 episodes so far. That's pretty interesting. And then to wrap up the podcast with the time that we have left, I have two questions I like to ask every guest. So I've done this 170 episodes plus now. I think I'm going to live until I'm 103 hopefully, and then I'm going to be on a rocking chair thinking about all the cool things hopefully I do in my career. If I put you in that same position, 103-year-old Mandy on a rocking chair, thinking about all the things you've done in your career so far, what's maybe one story that stands out that when you're 103 you're for sure going to remember it and be like, wow, what a time that was?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a few short ones because it all comes down to the same thing. And I think for me, when I think about like my legacy, so someone asked me a legacy question recently, which was interesting because I've never thought of it that way. I want to help as many people as possible. Like that's truly why I've done everything I've done in my life. So even with Cleanify, I would get calls from cleaners all the time being like, oh, like by being on your platform, I've been able to grow my business, and now I can afford to bring my son over from like Ethiopia. I'd get calls like that all the time. And then you think about like the cannabis company, my whole reason for starting that was the accessibility problem that I think a lot of people are facing. And when I did a lot of research and surveys and that sort of thing, I saw that the majority of our users had some form of disability, whether it was a physical disability or a mental disability, something like that. And that's exactly who it was intended for. Obviously, you have like the people who are just potheads and they're like stoned eating pizza at home and need some more. But majority of the users did have some other medicinal reason to use it. And so I saw hundreds of people, if not thousands of people that we were helping. And I love that aspect of it. And the reason why I wanted to get in VC is because I was like, how do I have the most impact? I could start a company and have some impact that way, or I can invest in 20, 30 companies in my first fund and think of how many people I get to touch that way, right? Like not only just the founders that I'm providing access to different networks to, providing capital, support, that sort of thing, but also all of their customers that they're touching, right? And so I think that like, if I want to think about being 103 sitting in a rocking chair, it's like how many people was I able to help in those 103 years?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to summarize and very cool to like think of when you're saying like how many, people or actions can then be impacted just from, some of the things you're doing, which is very cool. And then now, so we went into the future, 103-year-old Mandy, are going all the way to, let's say you're about to walk on to your first class at your design school. Let's say you're 16, 17, 18 years old. If you're able to go back in time and have a conversation with your younger self, is there one piece of advice that you've now learned that you could share with your younger self that's like, hey, this is the one thing that if I could share anything with you, this is something you should know? What would that be?
Yeah. I think for me, I've never had like a big issue with confidence, but I know that a lot of people, especially from marginalized communities, do because we're kind of taught to shut up and be quiet and be small. I've always kind of been a bit of a louder, bigger person in general. But there's been moments, like when I think about those times that I was in those investor meetings as like a young queer woman, where I felt kind of shitty and I felt small and I was like, oh, maybe I should just be quiet, you know? But I've learned through my years that even now, I go to conferences that I speak at, and 90% of the room is like white guys in blue suits. And I look like a fucking weirdo in those rooms. Like everyone's kind of like who invited that person, you know? But I see that as like this massive strength because people get really interested and they come over and talk to me like, oh shit, you're up to like some really cool things. And so I think a lot of it is just like literally be yourself and just be confident and don't let anyone like dull that shit, because that's what I truly believe is the strength. And this is also a part of the reason, not a part of the reason, this is the reason why we call it Misfit Ventures. It's because a lot of marginalized people feel like misfits, right? Especially in rooms like I just explained. Like I'm like, shit, I'm a misfit, but I see that as a strength. I'm like, thank God I'm a misfit. I don't want to conform. I don't want to look like the rest of the crowd. And I think that it's been a big reason why I've been able to see some of the success that I've been able to see too. So yeah, I think that's what I would tell myself is in those moments of doubt that I've had, like get over it. Like this is literally the thing that's gonna get you to where you want to be.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly why I like asking the question at the end, because I find it kind of summarizes it well. And unless there's anything else you'd like to share, I really appreciate you coming on and telling your story. I feel like there's so many things we could have got into, but I really appreciate you sharing nonetheless.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to reminisce and go back in time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, with that, that's it for episode 176. Stay tuned to the next episode, and thank you again, Mandy.
Thank you so much.